There is a quiet power in the life of a man who walks alone. A man who is not defined by who walks beside him, but by who he becomes in the silence of his own company. Society loves to whisper in his ear, "You need someone beside you." People ask him, "Why are you alone? Why don't you have a girlfriend? Why haven't you settled?" They assume loneliness. They assume emptiness. They assume something is missing. But here is the truth. Sometimes walking alone is not a weakness. It is a phase of transformation. Sometimes solitude is not a punishment, it is preparation. And sometimes being without a girlfriend isn't a sign that something is wrong with you. It is a season where you build yourself so strongly that the wrong person can never break you again. A man who lives alone learns. He observes, he rebuilds. He rewires his mind. He becomes self-sufficient, emotionally stable, mentally stronger, and spiritually grounded. He learns to enjoy his own company, and that is where the journey of real confidence begins. Today, I want to give you 5 life-changing key notes that will redefine the meaning of living alone as a man. There is a powerful truth many people never learn because they are too afraid to be alone. Solitude is not a punishment, it is an invitation. When a man lives alone, without a girlfriend, without the noise of constant companionship, without someone filling the silence, he steps into a rare space that most people never get to experience. And that space becomes the birthplace of his identity, his discipline, and his destiny. When you live alone, you meet the one person you spent your whole life avoiding, yourself. No distractions, no one to blame, no one to impress, just you and the truth. Just solitude becomes a mirror. It reflects your fears, your insecurities, your habits, your dreams, your weaknesses, and your potential. Most people run from this mirror because they're terrified of what they might see. But the moment a man stops running and stands in that silence, he begins to grow. There is a difference between being lonely and being alone. Loneliness is emptiness. Solitude is empowerment. Loneliness is when you feel like something is missing. Solitude is when you realize nothing is missing. Everything you need is already inside you. Society tells you that a man must always be in a relationship, always be searching for someone, always be validated by a partner. They say a man without a girlfriend is incomplete. They couldn't be more wrong. A man who learns to live alone becomes emotionally bulletproof. He becomes someone who does not seek approval. He does not chase validation. He does not crumble under pressure because he has already spent time fighting his inner battles. A man who lives alone learns responsibility. Every dish washed, every bill paid, every decision made becomes a lesson in self-reliance. He stops waiting for someone to motivate him. He becomes his own motivator, his own caretaker, his own protector, his own source of strength. He learns to enjoy the silence instead of fearing it. He learns to enjoy his own company instead of needing others to fill the void. He learns to listen to his thoughts instead of drowning them in distractions. In solitude, a man begins to understand what he truly values. Peace, purpose, discipline, growth. He becomes grounded. He becomes intentional. He learns to live not for the approval of the world, but for the alignment of his own soul. And because he is alone, he becomes productive. He stops wasting time trying to impress people who don't matter. He stops chasing relationships that drain him. He stops compromising his goals just to be liked. He starts building something, a career, a mindset, a future. He learns to master time, his emotions, and his focus. He learns to replace neediness with confidence, loneliness with purpose, and uncertainty with clarity. And the most powerful part, when a man becomes whole on his own, he is no longer afraid to lose anyone, because he realizes he never needed anyone to complete him, only to complement him. A man who can stand strong alone is a man who can stand strong anywhere. A man who finds himself in solitude becomes unstoppable in society. And a man who builds his identity before entering a relationship will never lose himself inside one. Solitude doesn't break a man, it builds him. It forges him, it strengthens him, it elevates him. Because when a man learns who he is alone, he becomes someone the world can no longer shake. There is a profound misunderstanding in today's world, the belief that when a man lives alone, he must be lonely, unfulfilled, or somehow incomplete. Society has tried to convince men that unless they are constantly surrounded by people, constantly in relationships, constantly entertaining noise and distraction, something must be wrong with them. But solitude is not emptiness. Solitude is architecture. It is the space where a man constructs himself. It is the ground where a man plants his identity, brick by brick, moment by moment, until he becomes solid enough to stand alone and powerful enough to move forward with intention. When a man chooses to live alone, not as an escape, not as a rejection of relationships, but as a deliberate chapter of self-evolution, he is not isolating himself. He is incubating himself. He is stepping back from the noise of the world long enough to hear the sound of his own thoughts, his own dreams, his own voice. And that voice is often the quietest, yet the most important. You cannot hear it when life is crowded with expectations, opinions, and emotional demands. You hear it when the world goes silent. You hear it in the stillness that only solitude can provide. A man who lives alone enters a sacred space, one where he is both the sculptor and the sculpture. In the silence of his home, he evaluates who he is without performance, without pressure, without the need to impress anyone. He learns to face his weaknesses without shame and his strengths without arrogance. He begins to understand what he truly wants, not what others say he should want. That clarity becomes the foundation of real confidence, the type of confidence that does not rely on validation, applause, or romance to stay alive. Solitude does not take away from a man, it adds to him. It sharpens his mind, strengthens his discipline, and deepens his emotional awareness. When you are alone, you notice your habits. You see what time you wake up when no one checks on you. You see how you treat yourself when no one is watching. You understand how disciplined you really are when there is no one to hold you accountable. And that type of self-observation is the birthplace of transformation. Because once a man truly sees himself, he cannot hide from the truth anymore. He must rise or remain small. Solitude gives him that choice. In this quiet space, a man also learns self-respect. When he cooks for himself, cleans for himself, pays his bills, manages his time, and organizes his life, something powerful happens. He develops self-honor. He becomes the king of his own interior kingdom. He realizes that his life does not need an audience to be meaningful. His growth does not require spectators. His success does not need an applause track. He learns to be enough for himself. And here is the greater truth: a man who becomes strong in solitude becomes unstoppable in society. He interacts with people not from desperation, but from completeness. He does not cling, he chooses. He does not beg for attention, he commands respect. He does not chase love. He attracts it naturally, because the man who is comfortable being alone becomes magnetic. He becomes grounded. He becomes clear. He becomes someone whose presence carries weight because it is built on self-mastery. So, understand this: living alone is not a failure. It is not a sign of weakness. It is an investment, one of the greatest investments a man can make. When a man embraces solitude with purpose, intention, and discipline, he transforms it into a sanctuary of growth. He emerges wiser, stronger, more aware of himself and the world around him. Solitude becomes the birthplace of his power, the place where he reconstructs himself into the man he was always meant to become. There comes a point in a man's life when he begins to understand that solitude is not punishment. It's preparation. It's not loneliness. It's leadership. When a man chooses to live alone, without the constant noise of relationships, arguments, expectations, or emotional chaos, he steps into a space where he can finally hear the most important voice in his life, his own. In a world that tells men they must always be in a relationship, always find someone, always prove their worth by who they have beside them, a choosing solitude is an act of rebellion. It's choosing to live life on your own terms. And that choice builds emotional strength in a way nothing else can. When a man lives alone, he has no one to blame and no one to lean on. He becomes responsible for everything: the bills, the goals, the discipline, the mistakes, the victories, and the failures. There is no emotional cushion, no partner to absorb the bad days, no hand to hold when life gets hard. And that, ironically, is what creates power. Because a man who learns to survive emotional storms alone becomes unshakable when he enters a room full of people. Solitude forces a man to confront himself, his patterns, his weaknesses, his angers, and his untapped potential. It strips away distractions and exposes the truth. And yes, sometimes the truth hurts. But sometimes the truth heals. You cannot hide from yourself in solitude. You learn who you really are, and only when you know yourself can you ever build a life of meaning. Most men run from silence because silence tells the truth. Silence shows the wounds they never healed, the emotions they never processed, and the fears they never faced. But a man who embraces silence becomes a man who conquers his inner world. He becomes emotionally strong because he has learned to sit with the uncomfortable, the painful, the uncertain, without running away, without drowning it in relationships or temporary companionship. People like to say men living alone are missing something. But what they don't understand is that these men are gaining everything: clarity, focus, maturity, independence, purpose. Emotional strength does not come from having someone. It comes from learning to stand firm when you have no one. A man who lives alone learns emotional control. He learns to manage his thoughts. He learns to regulate his feelings. He learns that not every emotion deserves a reaction. Not every desire must be followed. Not every fear is a threat. He builds emotional muscles, just like he builds physical ones, through discipline, consistency, and perseverance. And what happened to man who has built emotional strength eventually chooses to share his life with someone? He shows up differently. He shows up as a whole man, not a half-healed one. He shows up with stability, not insecurity. He shows up because he chooses to, not because he needs to. He becomes a partner who can lead, provide emotional safety, and protect, not through dominance, but through groundedness. But even if he never chooses companionship, his life is still full. Because emotional strength gives him something many people never achieve: inner peace. The peace of knowing who he is. The peace of living life on his own terms. The peace of not being dependent on anyone for happiness. Solitude does not weaken a man. Solitude shapes a man. It builds him, strengthens him, and prepares him for greatness. A man who masters solitude becomes a man who can handle the world. And there is nothing more powerful than a man who is emotionally strong, because he has learned to be strong alone. There is a profound kind of discipline that only a man who lives alone can build. Discipline that isn't motivated by impressing anyone, proving anything, or competing with anyone. It is a discipline born from silence, from stillness, from the comes when no one is around to distract you, validate you, or applaud you. When you live alone, you don't have an audience. You don't have someone cheering for you or reminding you of what needs to be done. You have only yourself, your choices, and your commitment, and that is where true discipline is forged. When you live without a girlfriend, there are no emotional highs and lows pulling your attention. You aren't spending nights arguing overthinking, texting, or trying to decode mixed signals. Instead, your energy is directed inward. Your time becomes yours again. Your mind becomes uncluttered. Your habits become intentional. The man who lives alone has the unique opportunity to build a routine so sharp, so structured, so powerful that it transforms him from the inside out. This period of solitude allows you to take full ownership of your life. No one is coming to save you. No one is coming to motivate you. No one is coming to push you out of bed. And because of that, every single action becomes a choice you either take or avoid. And that is where accountability is born. You start to see that if you don't cook, you don't eat. If you don't work, you fall behind. If you don't clean, you live in chaos. Life becomes a mirror reflecting your habits back at you. This is why men who embrace solitude often become the most disciplined versions of themselves. They learn to structure their morning routines with precision. They learn to exercise not because someone is watching, but because they've built internal standards. They learn to manage their finances with responsibility because they know no one will rescue them from mismanagement. They learn to focus deeply on their career, their goals, their health, all the things that shape a strong, grounded, self-reliant man. Living alone gives you something rare, the freedom to optimize your environment for greatness. You can create a space that fuels ambition. Maybe it's a small place, maybe it's quiet, maybe it's simple, but it becomes a temple for your growth. You can fill it with books, journals, workout equipment, vision boards, business plans. Whatever supports your evolution, and you don't have to apologize to anyone for wanting to grow. This solitude teaches you mental toughness. It teaches you how to handle boredom without needing stimulation. It teaches you how to deal with stress without emotional dependency. It teaches you how to sit with your own thoughts instead of drowning them out with noise. A man who can master himself when alone becomes unstoppable when he steps into the world. You become the type of man who doesn't crumble under pressure. You become the type of man who doesn't run to someone for comfort every time life gets hard. You become the type of man who knows how to lead himself and eventually lead others. But the most powerful part, you start to understand that discipline is not punishment. It is not restriction. It is self-respect. It is the highest form of self-love a man can practice. It is the language of your future self thanking you for the choices you make today. Solitude is not weakness. It is preparation. It is the silent workshop where the strong, most capable, most dependable men are built. If you embrace it fully, it will sculpt you into a man who doesn't just survive alone, a man who thrives alone. And once you can thrive alone, you become a man who is truly free. There is a unique kind of strength that comes from living alone, a strength many people will never understand because most people spend their lives surrounded by noise. Noise from the world. Noise from relationships, noise from responsibilities, and most importantly, noise from the expectations of others. But a man who lives alone learns early that he cannot hide behind noise. He faces only himself. And that experience, though it may begin in silence, quickly becomes the birthplace of his greatest power. Living alone forces a man to meet the uncensored truth about who he really is. There is no one to entertain him, no one to distract him, no one to validate him. The mirror becomes honest, the mind becomes direct, and the heart reveals what it actually wants instead of what the world says it should want. Many men fear this silence because silence is where you meet your truth. But the man who learns to sit in that silence without running from himself becomes a different creature entirely. He becomes unshakable. Because when you live alone long enough, you stop negotiating with your weaknesses, you stop waiting for approval, you stop depending on encouragement, you stop looking for someone else to tell you that you are enough. You start building yourself from the inside out. You begin carving out your own identity, your own routine, your own rhythm. This is not loneliness. This is self-assembly. This is construction. This is rebirth. A man who lives alone learns self-discipline, not because someone demands it, because his life requires it. There is no one to pick up after him, no one to cook for him. No one to push him out of bed, no one to tell him what he should or shouldn't be doing. His habits build his future or they destroy it. And that realization turns him into a machine of responsibility. When you rely only on yourself, you evolve. You grow, you rise. Because you have to. Many people assume being alone makes a man fragile. In truth, it makes him formidable. Why? Because solitude is where emotional independence is forged. A man who lives alone learns not to crumble when someone leaves. He learns not to let heartbreak erase him. He learns not to panic when life shifts. He has already survived nights with no comfort, problems with no partner, fears with no reassurance. When you learn to stand alone, you become impossible to break. And something else happens, something far more important. He learns the difference between being wanted and being needed. When you live alone, you stop begging for love. You stop clinging to people. You stop chasing relationships just to fill space. You start choosing people intentionally. You start recognizing who nourishes you and who drains you. You realize that your peace is the most expensive thing you own, and not everyone can afford access to it. A man who has mastered solitude becomes dangerous. Not in a destructive way, but in a powerful way. Dangerous because he cannot be manipulated. Dangerous because he cannot be pressured. Dangerous he does not fear walking away. Dangerous because he knows how to survive without depending on anyone else. When a man builds a full, rich, meaningful life alone, when he learns to enjoy his own company, manage his own home, control his own emotions, and sculpt his own path, then relationships become bonuses, not necessities. Love becomes a choice, not a lifeline, and confidence becomes natural, not borrowed. A man who lives alone is not empty. He is evolving, not lonely, but awakening, not lost, but becoming. He is building a world inside himself that no one can damage, no one can shake, and no one can take away. That is power, that is manhood, that is freedom. A man who lives alone without a girlfriend is not incomplete. He is not lost. He is not behind. He is in a sacred season that many people never get to experience. The season of building himself without distractions, without noise, without the emotional demands that pull most men away from their purpose. This is the season where a man discovers what he truly wants, not what society expects from him. He learns to be calm in his own silence, strong in his own company, and confident in his own identity. Solitude becomes his teacher, discipline becomes his companion, and vision becomes his guide. Alone time is not a punishment, it is preparation. This is where a man's character sharpens. This is where his emotional maturity grows. This is where his self-worth is forged. He no longer seeks validation from others because he has learned to validate himself. He stops chasing temporary attention because he understands the value of long-term peace. He no longer fears being alone because he has learned to enjoy his own presence. And the truth is, when a man can stand alone, he becomes unstoppable. He becomes selective. He becomes intentional. He becomes the kind of man who chooses a relationship, not because he needs one, but because he is ready to share a life he has already built. A man who lives alone is not waiting for someone to complete him. He is building himself so powerfully that when someone finally enters his life, they join a man who knows where he is going. Solitude is not emptiness, it is strength. So if you are a man living alone right now, understand this: you are not behind, evolving. You are not lonely. You are growing. You are not missing out. You are rising into the strongest version of yourself. Your journey may be quiet, but it is sacred. Your progress may be unseen, but it is real. And one day, The world will witness the man you built in silence. Stay patient. Stay focused. Stay grounded, because a man who learns to stand alone becomes a man who can conquer anything.